So welcome to my second video on snow cars in GTA Online. And do you ever feel like you've opened Pandora's box?
What's in the box?
Oh, nothing to worry about, really.
Oh, what's in the box?
Well, maybe a couple of opinions that got people talking, but...
What's in the box?
Alright, so, in my first video, which you can find here, I did some tests of cars that I thought should be okay in the snow in GTA Online. And I used a very scientific method of picking the ones that I thought would be alright. And then I tested them on my across the lap. And some of them did incredibly poorly, and some of them gave really surprising results. So what I thought I'd do is I'd pick some of the poor performers and then line them up against some other cars that should all be absolutely awful in the snow. And then on top of that, I thought I'd throw in the three big hitters. That's the three fastest cars in GTA Online: the Niobe, the Stinger TT, and the brand new Banshee. What can possibly go wrong? So, I gave myself a couple of rules for this one as well. Again, no fiddling with the settings, no off-road tyres, none of that. Also, they all had one lap each, so no do-overs for this one because I'm using my full lap, which takes, depending on the car, 8 to 10 minutes. And this is a good point to talk about the times for these things. So for reference, for anyone that's new to the channel, a time between 10 and 11 minutes is hideously slow, and that's a car that should be avoided. A time between 9 and 10 minutes is kind of okay, it's reasonably okay, probably something you're going to be able to have some fun with. A time between 8 and 9 minutes is a really quick car, so all of the times within that range are good bits of kit, things that you'll be able to have a load of fun with. Any times under 8 minutes are seriously quick cars, so anything that can do my lap in under 8 minutes is an absolute beast of a thing. So what I thought I needed is I needed to put down a banker. So I needed to pop a car in there and give it a bit of a test, and for that I chose a car that I thought would be absolutely awful. Now when I chose this, I thought that would prove my point, so I went for the Arbiter HSW. This thing's practically undrivable in the dry, it's totally undrivable in the wet, so surely it would be even worse in the snow. And you know what? It was absolutely goddamn awful. However, when I came to check the time at the end, it had done it 11 seconds faster than I'd managed in the dry. So this is going to be quite an interesting test. And we start with 13th, and that's the hijack rusten. So it drives how you would expect it to drive, and the reason I tested this one is when I did the lap for the, well, when I did the dry lap in this one, it seemed to go an awful lot faster in the rain than it did in the dry. So I thought, bit of snow, maybe this will be a bit of a sleeper, a bit of a snow sleeper as it were, a bit of a beast. And no, it was wrong. Well, it was wrong, I was wrong. It was 18 seconds slower, which actually isn't that bad, but it was quite good fun to drive, surprisingly. It coped with everything incredibly well, and I think that's a theme on this list, as you'll see as we go through. Moving up to 12th place, I thought I'd throw some muscle cars in here, because surely all of the muscle cars will be dreadful, so I went for one that's really quick and can be a bit of a handful, which is the Dominator ASP. Now it's not the most leery of the muscle cars, I will admit that, but still, front engine, rear drive, lots of power, this thing should have been an absolute stinking turd of a lap. And it was a little bit slower, but not much. It was 7 seconds slower in the snow than it was in the dry, and over a 13-mile lap, and yes, this is a 13-mile lap, 7 seconds is not bad at all, so I think this classes as still pretty awesome. And in 11th place we've got the first of the cars that didn't fare very well in my original test, and that's the Calico. So this is already set up for off-road, it's got off-road tyres on, and this is one that I expected to absolutely tear through my previous lap, but it got really bogged down on the off-road section. Now, moving it into the fully tarmac-based lap, it did an awful lot better. In fact, on the full lap of the track, this was only 2 seconds slower than it managed on the dry lap. So I think you can say this has pretty much redeemed itself. And now we're starting to get into some weird things. The DR1. I wanted to put an open wheeler on there, and I'll be honest, I wanted to do the BR8, but the DR1 just looks so much better, especially when you can make it look like a McLaren. So how did this do? Well, the reason I chose this is because this has, or the open wheel cars should I say, have huge amounts of downforce, and there were certain things in the testing that made me think that the way Rockstar have applied the loss of grip in the snow is just by fiddling with the traction values. And possibly, and I don't know if any data miners have looked at this, and if you have, feel free to drop the video in the comments and I'll pin it. And it kind of feels like maybe they've just done it on a fixed value, so that any cars that have a huge amount of downforce, the amount of downforce they've got kind of seems to cancel out any loss of grip from having the snow. And this kind of proves that a little bit, because the DR1, I managed to do a lap that was actually 1 second faster in the snow than I managed in the dry, and it wasn't even a clean lap. And then we move on to the Autark. So you can see there's a theme here. All of these should be absolutely dreadful in the snow. I mean, why on earth would you expect the Autark to be any good in the snow? You just wouldn't. But is it? Well, yes. It suffers in the main way that most of the other cars do in the snow, in that it really affects the turning. But the Autark was still putting in a really decent lap. It was 22 seconds slower in the snow than it was in the dry, so it did lose more than some of the others, but it still put in a really respectable lap. And then we arrive at the Stinger, and I know I said no do-overs, but it's the Stinger, so inevitably, yeah, that was bound to happen. So the Stinger did get a do-over, and even with that, this thing suffered more than any car that I tested. One thing I always criticise the Stinger for is having a really poor turning, and that is exaggerated by the snow. So when you try and steer this thing in the snow, it kind of looks at the inputs from your stick and takes it as a suggestion rather than an instruction. And it's just so slow to react to anything. It's almost impossible to avoid any of the cars. And as a result, this lap was 1 minute and 17 seconds slower in the snow than it was in the dry. So this is easily the worst snow car I've tested. And back to some weird stuff with the LM87, going back to my theory about downforce. Now, the LM87 didn't really set the lap on fire, but it did do incredibly well. It set a very respectable time. It was only 17 seconds slower in the snow than it was on the in the dry. And I should say, just remind you, this is between a 7.5 and an 11-minute lap. So 17 seconds over all of that time is not a lot at all. And this, possibly above all the others, was still really good fun to drive. That's one thing that I found while I was doing this. A lot of these cars that can feel a little bit stale in the dry, they kind of come alive in the snow. I really enjoyed driving the LM87 in the snow. It was a little more difficult, but still incredibly quick and a really good choice. Sticking with the theme of high downforce cars that should be absolutely awful, we move on to the Tyrus. Now, just like a lot of these other high downforce cars, you still keep an incredible amount of grip. So as you'll see as I come round here, the amount of downforce it generates and the amount of grip you manage to retain means you can still really thrash the hell out of this thing, and it still responds really well, gives you a really good time. It's surprisingly easy to handle around the town, and this one, and wait for it, my snow lap in this was 49 seconds faster than my dry lap. Now, one thing I will say, my dry lap in the Tyrus was from a long time ago, so it could just be that I've got a little bit better and I had a little bit of practice at doing these snow laps by the time I got round to the Tyrus, but still, 49 seconds faster in the snow is not to be sniffed at. This is a fabulous car, and one you can absolutely still use while we've got the snow in GTA. And we've got to get some bikes in there. So this came as a suggestion from one of the comments from a previous video, and that was a Power Surge, which apparently has around a 10% top speed advantage in the snow. Now I haven't tested that, but based on the lap, it certainly doesn't seem to be any slower. Now this is one where I couldn't compare it, because even though I know for a fact that I've done the lap, for some reason, idiot me seems to have not edited it, not put it live, and I can't find the footage anywhere. But I know for a fact that I did it, so let's just assume it's about the same, because realistically from this lap that I did, there was virtually no loss of traction, there was hardly any sliding, and it's almost as if there was no snow at all. And that's the theme with one of the others that we'll come back to later. Driving this, or should I say riding this in the snow, seems to make very little difference. It's still controllable, it's still fast, and it puts in really an incredible lap time. This does a 7:58, so that's already in the under 8-minute range, which is reserved just for the fastest vehicles in the game. And now we have another car that has redeemed itself. The Larus, trying to pronounce it correctly, was utterly dreadful on my across the map. It could barely manage any of the hills, and it didn't really make up for it, I thought, on the tarmac section. Now, one thing that is notable for all of the cars, and you can see it a little bit more with this one of the things that you do have to do when you're driving these things in the snow is just be that tiny little bit more careful, because little knocks on lampposts and little knocks on cars, the sort of things that you would brush off on a dry road, really can send you careering off in a ball of flames in the snow. And this really highlights that, because you can see the slight little knocks send it all over the place. But even with that said, it still did a very respectable lap of 7:52, although that was 40 seconds slower than the dry lap. But that said, the dry lap was so quick. This is one of those cars that you can just use it anyway. And now we hit another one of the big three, the Niobe. Didn't do particularly well on my previous test, and I'll be honest, in this test it was 31 seconds slower around the lap in the snow than it was in the dry, but it was still pretty decent. It seemed to hold its own. It's kind of a twitchy car anyway, and the snow makes it more twitchy in some areas, but also the fact that the snow does dull the turn-in on all of the cars, that does take a tiny little bit of that twitchiness away. So it's still perfectly reasonable to drive, perfectly enjoyable to drive, and still pretty damn quick. It still came third in this list, and that is with arguably one of the scruffiest laps I've ever done in the Niobe. So the Niobe, absolutely going to be, contrary to what I said in my previous video, if you're just staying on the roads, this is going to be a solid choice. And now we get to the big guns, the Banshee. So this stole the crown from the Niobe as the fastest car when it was released just over a week ago. And everything about this tells you it should be absolutely dreadful in the snow. It's a muscle car. It's a powerful front engine rear wheel drive car. Everything about this tells you it should be absolutely dreadful in the snow. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it lost some time. But the fact that this is just so controllable anyway, as I said in my previous video, this is easily the most controllable of the HSW vehicles when fully upgraded. And that carries over into the snow. Yes, it does dull the turning a little bit, but it is still incredibly fast, much easier to control than you would expect for a car that's set up this way. And whilst it did lose 22 seconds over its time in the dry, this still put in the second fastest lap of any of the vehicles that I tested. And some of you might have already noticed that I said vehicles and not cars, and that's because once again my top pick for the snow is not a car, it's a bike. And it's a pretty surprising bike in that it's the Hakuchu Drag. So this is the king of the time trials. It's notoriously difficult to ride at full speed because things come at you so quickly, you find it really difficult to react in time to get out of the way. But the strange thing is, in the snow, it's surprisingly unaffected. It still has a huge amount of traction, it still has incredible braking, it still has the same sort of turning. One thing you can criticise the Hakuchu Drag for is for not having a great turning, and yeah, the snow doesn't help that, but in some ways it kind of makes it that little bit more controllable. You factor in that this, very much like the Tropos Rally, almost seems to dig in. It has far more grip than it really should, and it just powers around the whole track. So much so that the times I did in this are virtually identical. The snow lap was 2 seconds slower than the dry lap. 2 seconds. That's virtually nothing, and considering that this lap wasn't really particularly clean, as you'll see in a second, because GTA was not my friend today.
Huh?
So yeah, putting in a 7:06, this was an absolutely astonishing time. I didn't expect to get anywhere near that in this. So this, after another set of reviews, is probably going to be one of my top picks for this snow season. It was amazingly good to drive and amazingly easy. So what does that mean for my theories? Have I actually managed to prove that it's all about downforce?
No.
Have I proved that the car doesn't make a difference?
No.
Have I actually proved anything at all?
No.
So what is the point of this video?
I don't know! Stop bothering me!
Well, I guess the point is that maybe it's time to ignore what us lot are saying on YouTube, and through this snow season in GTA, just drive whatever the hell you like. Because on the most part, the cars, whilst they're a bit twitchy around the city, they still put in decent laps. Some of them are more fun, yes, some of them are awful, but the only way you can find out is to try them all for yourself. So please, do let me know in the comments how you get on, and I hope you found that useful. And here are the times they all managed to do.